The room went quiet the moment the host finished reading the document. I stood in the middle of a ballroom full of people, one hand resting on my pregnant belly, watching my ex-fiancé's face drain of color. His mother looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under her. I remember thinking one simple thing. 3 months ago you called me a useless woman. Now half the town was staring at the proof that she had been wrong. Daniel Harper opened his mouth like he wanted to say something. Nothing came out. That was the moment I realized something important. The worst night of my life, the night he left me, was the night that saved me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where this story really began. My name is Laura Bennett. I'm 38 years old and I've lived in Cedar Rapids, Iowa my entire life. Not the glamorous side of town either. Just a quiet neighborhood of small ranch houses, cracked sidewalks, and the same maple trees that have been standing there longer than most of us. I manage the front office for Harrison Roofing and Construction. It's a family-owned company, been around since the 70s. My days are usually filled with invoices, scheduling crews, and answering calls from homeowners worried about leaks after a Midwest storm. Nothing dramatic. My life used to be pretty predictable. Work during the week, grocery shopping at Hy-Vee on Saturdays, church with my sister on Sundays. And for the last 5 years I thought I was building a future with a man named Daniel Harper. Daniel was 41, a real estate agent with a big smile and a bigger personality. He had that kind of confidence that fills a room before he even says anything. The first time we met, he was showing a house next door to my apartment building. He cracked a joke about my car being parked too close to the curb. That's how it started. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into weekends together. Before long, we were talking about marriage. Looking back now, there were small signs I ignored. Daniel talked about kids constantly. Not in a sweet, hopeful way. More like it was part of a checklist. House, wife, children. Preferably 2 boys. At the time, I didn't think much about it. I always assumed that part of life would happen naturally. Then came the doctor appointment. It was a routine checkup at Mercy Medical Center with Dr. Patel, my OB-GYN. I wasn't worried about anything serious. I just figured it was time for a yearly exam. Dr. Patel sat across from me in that small office with the beige walls and framed medical certificates. He folded his hands carefully before speaking. That was the first moment my stomach dropped. Doctors only do that when they're about to say something difficult. "Laura," he said gently, "your test results show that your ovarian reserve is quite low for your age." I stared at him. "I'm sorry, what does that mean exactly?" "It means pregnancy could be difficult, not impossible, but unlikely without assistance." The words hung in the air between us. Unlikely. I nodded like I understood. But honestly, my brain had stopped processing things. I drove home in silence. Daniel was sitting at my kitchen table when I walked in. He had stopped by to drop off takeout from Texas Roadhouse. "Hey," he said, "how'd the appointment go?" I sat down slowly. "Well, the doctor says getting pregnant might be difficult." Daniel didn't react right away. He just stared at the table. Then he nodded once. "Okay," he said. That was it. No hug, no reassurance. Just, okay. 2 days later, he asked if we could talk. He chose Applebee's on First Avenue. I still remember the smell of fried food when we walked inside. The place was busy. A baseball game played on the TVs over the bar. People laughed at nearby tables. But our booth felt strangely quiet. Daniel stirred his iced tea for a long time before speaking. Finally, he looked up. "Laura, I've been thinking." My chest tightened. That doctor appointment changed things. I felt the words coming before he even said them. "I want kids," he continued. "You know that." "I know," I said softly. "And if that's not possible?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "I have to think about my future." I waited. Maybe he would say something else. Maybe he would say we could figure it out together. He didn't. Instead, he said something that still echoes in my mind. "I think we should cancel the wedding." Just like that. 5 years. Gone between the appetizer and the check. I remember staring at the table while the waitress asked if we wanted dessert. Neither of us answered. When I got home that night, I sat on my couch and stared at the wall for a long time. The apartment felt different. Quieter. Like something important had already moved out. 2 days later, his mother came to visit. Janet Harper was 65, sharp-tongued and proud of it. She showed up unannounced around noon. The moment she walked in, her perfume filled the room, something strong and sweet that made my head ache. She looked around my apartment slowly, like she was inspecting property she might purchase. Then she turned to me. "Daniel told me about the doctor." I nodded. She folded her arms. "You understand why he ended the engagement, don't you?" I didn't answer. She stepped closer. "Daniel deserves a real family." Her voice had a tight, almost cheerful tone. "A marriage without children is pointless." I felt heat creeping up my neck. She paused for a moment. Then she delivered the sentence I would never forget. "You're a useless woman." Just like that. No anger. No shouting. She said it like she was stating a fact about the weather. Then she turned and walked out. I stood there in the doorway long after her car drove away. That week was one of the hardest of my life. Calling relatives to explain the wedding was canceled. Contacting the venue. Canceling the photographer. One afternoon I drove across town to the post office to retrieve the last stack of invitations I hadn't mailed yet. Holding those ivory envelopes in my hands made something inside me crack. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was grief. That night I sat alone in my apartment. The kitchen clock ticked loudly on the wall. Outside, a light rain tapped against the windows. I kept thinking the same thing. Maybe that was it. Maybe my chance at happiness had quietly passed me by. I went to bed believing my future had just ended. What I didn't know was that life had other plans waiting just a few weeks ahead. Because 2 months later I met a man named Robert Hayes. And that meeting changed everything. I met Robert Hayes on a Tuesday afternoon that started like any other. It was early April, and Cedar Rapids had that muddy gray look it gets right after winter finally lets go. The snow was gone, but the trees were still bare, and the wind had that damp chill that sneaks through your jacket. I was at work finishing up payroll when my boss, Walter Hayes, leaned into my office doorway. Walter was in his early 50s, built like a guy who had spent most of his life on rooftops. "Laura," he said, holding up his truck keys, "you eaten yet?" I shook my head. "Not yet." "Good," he said. "Come with me. I'm meeting my brother for lunch." Normally I would have said no. After everything with Daniel, I'd been keeping to myself. Work, home, repeat. But something about the way Walter said it made it feel less like an invitation and more like a friendly order. So I grabbed my coat. 10 minutes later, we were pulling into the parking lot of Perkins Restaurant and Bakery on Collins Road. If you've ever been to a Perkins, you know the smell the moment you walk in. Coffee, pancakes, syrup, and something buttery coming from the kitchen. It was busy but not crowded. A man sitting in a booth near the window stood when we approached. "Laura, this is my brother Walter," said. "Robert Hayes." Robert looked to be in his mid-40s. Taller than Walter, broader shoulders, with a calm, steady face that reminded me of someone used to dealing with emergencies without panicking. "Nice to meet you," he said, offering his hand. His grip was warm and firm, but not showy. "Nice to meet you too," I said. We slid into the booth. Robert stirred sugar into his coffee while Walter talked about a roofing job that had gone sideways. At first I mostly listened. But eventually Robert asked me about work. "What do you do at the office?" he asked. "Mostly paperwork," I said. "Scheduling crews, billing, answering phones." "That's the hard part," he said. "Keeping things organized." His voice was low and calm, the kind of voice you trust. Later I learned why. Robert had spent nearly 20 years as a firefighter with the Cedar Rapids Fire Department. He retired after a back injury the year before. At that first lunch, though, we kept things simple. Talked about the weather, the flooding Cedar Rapids used to get, local restaurants, small town things. But I remember one moment clearly. The waitress brought our pancakes and steam rose from the plates. Robert looked across the table and said something casual that stuck with me. "You've got a good laugh," he said. I blinked. "Sorry." "You laugh easy," he said with a small shrug. "That's rare these days." It wasn't flirting. Just an observation. Still, it made me smile. After lunch, we walked outside into the chilly wind. Walter headed back to the truck while Robert lingered a moment. "Nice meeting you," he said. "You too." That could have been the end of it. But a few days later, Walter mentioned that Robert had asked about me. Nothing pushy. Just curious. A week after that, Robert called. "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" he asked. His tone was careful, respectful. Not assuming. I hesitated. Part of me wasn't ready to open that door again. But something about his voice felt safe. So I said yes. We met at a small coffee shop downtown called Dash Coffee Roasters. It smelled like fresh beans and cinnamon. We sat near the window watching people walk past in the spring sunlight. At one point, Robert asked gently, "Walter told me you went through a rough breakup." I nodded slowly. "Yeah." He didn't interrupt. So I told him. About Daniel. About the wedding. About the doctor appointment. And eventually, about what his mother said. Robert listened quietly the entire time. No dramatic reaction. No angry comments. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and took a sip of coffee. Then he said something simple. "Kids aren't everything." I raised an eyebrow. "You don't want any—" He shrugged. "I was married once," he said. "My ex-wife wanted kids, badly. I wasn't against it, but I didn't want it to become the only thing our marriage was about." "What happened?" "She left," he said calmly. Said she didn't want to waste time. He said it without bitterness. Just like someone describing the weather. Then he looked at me and added quietly, "Peace matters more than a perfect plan." That sentence stayed with me. Over the next couple of months, Robert and I spent more time together. Nothing dramatic. Just ordinary things. He came over one Saturday and fixed the loose gutter outside my kitchen window. Another evening, he repaired a dripping faucet under my sink. The whole time he worked, he explained what he was doing like it was the most normal thing in the world. I remember watching his hands. Large, rough hands with small scars across the knuckles. Firefighter hands. Reliable hands. One night, a thunderstorm rolled through Cedar Rapids. Robert had picked me up for dinner, but the rain got so heavy we ended up sitting in his truck outside my apartment. The windshield wipers clicked back and forth, while classic rock played softly on the radio. We talked about nothing in particular. At one point, he looked out at the rain and said quietly, "Life doesn't need to be perfect." He glanced over at me. "Just peaceful." That might not sound like much. But after everything I'd been through, those words meant more than he probably realized. 3 months after we met, Robert asked if I wanted to get married. Not with a speech. Not with a fancy ring. We were sitting at my kitchen table eating takeout Chinese food. He set down his fork and said, "You want to build a quiet life together." I laughed. "That's your proposal?" "Pretty much." I thought about it for exactly 5 seconds. Then I said yes. We married 2 weeks later at the Lynn County Courthouse. No white dress. No flowers. Just a simple ceremony with the judge. Walter stood beside us, grinning like he'd been waiting years for this moment. After the judge pronounced us married, Robert squeezed my hand. I remember feeling something strange. Not fireworks. Not excitement. Something steadier. Relief. For the first time in a long while, I felt chosen for who I was. Not for what I might give someone. Just me. I assumed our life would stay quiet like that. Predictable. Peaceful. But one Tuesday morning about 3 months later, something happened that changed everything. I nearly fainted next to the copy machine at work. The room tilted for a second. That's the best way I can describe it. One moment I was standing beside the copy machine at the office feeding paperwork into the tray. The next moment the floor felt like it shifted under my feet. "Laura." I grabbed the edge of the counter. My coworker Megan looked at me from across the office. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said quickly. But I definitely wasn't. A wave of dizziness passed through me. My stomach rolled like I'd just stepped off a carnival ride. Megan walked over with a worried look. "You look pale," she said. "You sure you're all right?" "I'm fine," I insisted. She studied my face for a moment, then grinned. "Honestly, you look like you're pregnant." We both laughed. The idea was ridiculous. Still, the comment stayed in my head longer than it should have. Around 4 that afternoon, I stopped by the CVS on First Avenue on my way home. I told myself it was just curiosity. A silly little check to prove Megan's joke was wrong. The pharmacy aisle smelled faintly like cleaning products and plastic packaging. I grabbed a pregnancy test and tossed it into my basket along with toothpaste so it wouldn't look obvious. Back home, I set the small white stick on the bathroom counter. Just for peace of mind, I muttered to myself. The instructions said to wait 3 minutes. I didn't even make it to 1. 2 bright pink lines appeared almost instantly. I stared at them. Then I blinked. Then I picked up the test and turned it sideways like maybe the angle was wrong. Still 2 lines. My knees gave out and I sat down on the cool tile floor. For a second I laughed. Then I cried. Then I laughed again. Okay, I whispered. Okay, this has to be wrong. The next morning I scheduled an appointment with Dr. Patel. He looked just as surprised as I felt. We'll run another test, he said. Blood work confirmed it. Pregnant. But the real shock came during the ultrasound. The room was dim and quiet. The only light came from the monitor beside the exam table. Dr. Patel moved the wand across my stomach slowly. Then he stopped. He leaned closer to the screen. Well, he said. I immediately sat up a little. What? He turned the monitor toward me. 2 tiny shapes flickered against the dark background. 2 little pulses. Fast. Steady. Dr. Patel smiled. Laura, you're pregnant. He paused. And it looks like you're having twins. I didn't say anything. I just stared at the screen. 2 heartbeats. 2 tiny lives. My mind flashed back to that day in his office months earlier. Pregnancy would be difficult. Difficult wasn't the same thing as impossible. Dr. Patel must have seen the confusion on my face. Low ovarian reserve means lower chances, he explained gently. But sometimes nature surprises us. I drove home in a daze. The ultrasound picture sat in the passenger seat like it might float away if I didn't keep glancing at it. When I walked into the house, Robert was in the kitchen fixing the loose hinge on a cabinet door. He looked up. You're home early. I didn't say anything. I just held out the ultrasound photo. Robert wiped his hands on a towel and took it. He studied the image for several seconds. Then he looked up at me. Is this what I think it is? I nodded. And look closer, I said. He squinted. Then his eyebrows shot up.
Wait.
He leaned closer. Is that? 2, I said quietly. Robert let out a long breath. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he pulled me into a hug. A real hug. Strong arms wrapping around my shoulders like he meant it. We'll figure it out, he said softly. I could hear his heartbeat through his shirt. Together. Then he stepped back and laughed. A full, genuine laugh. Well, he said, rubbing the back of his neck, guess we're gonna need a bigger house. For the first time since the doctor appointment months earlier, I felt something new. Hope. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Doctor visits. Prenatal vitamins. Late-night internet searches about twin pregnancies. Robert started talking about converting the spare room into a nursery. Everything felt strange and wonderful at the same time. But Cedar Rapids is a small town. And news travels fast. One afternoon about a month later, I walked out of the office and saw a familiar car parked near the curb. Daniel Harper stepped out. He looked thinner. Nervous. His eyes dropped immediately to my stomach. You're really pregnant, he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. And twins, he asked quietly. Yeah. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. I heard people talking, but I thought it was just gossip. I kept my voice calm. You heard right. He stared at me like he was trying to solve a math problem. But the doctor said you couldn't have kids. No, I said gently. He said it might be difficult. Daniel didn't respond right away. His face slowly lost color. Then he said something that surprised me. I made a mistake. Before I could answer, a car horn sounded behind him. Daniel looked like he wanted to say more. Instead, he stepped back. Take care, Laura. Then he got into his car and drove away. I watched him go, thinking that was the end of it. But Daniel wasn't the real problem. His mother was. Because once Janet Harper heard the news, she decided to make sure the whole town heard her version of the story. Small towns have their advantages. People wave when they drive past your house. The cashier at Hy-Vee remembers your name. Neighbors shovel each other's sidewalks after snowstorms. But the downside, news travels faster than the weather. And gossip spreads even faster than that. The first whisper reached me about a week after Daniel showed up outside my office. I was standing near the coffee machine in our break room when 2 installers from the roofing crew walked in mid-conversation. They stopped when they saw me. One of them cleared his throat. Morning, Laura. Morning, I said. They poured their coffee quietly and left. But the look they gave each other before walking out told me everything. Something was being said. Later that afternoon, Megan leaned against my office doorway. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." She hesitated. "Well, Janet Harper has been telling people around town that those babies might not be Robert's." The words hung there between us. For a second, my stomach twisted. Then I exhaled slowly. Of course she was. Janet Harper had never been the kind of woman who admitted she was wrong. "People talk," Megan said gently. I nodded. "I know." But the whispers didn't stop there. At Hy-Vee, I caught a woman glancing at my stomach, then whispering to the person beside her. At church one Sunday, a couple I barely knew gave me a tight smile before quickly looking away. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The old shame started creeping back. One night I sat at the kitchen table staring down at the prenatal vitamins in front of me. Robert walked in carrying 2 grocery bags. He set them down and immediately noticed my expression. "What happened?" I told him everything. The rumors. The looks. The things Janet had been saying around town. Robert listened without interrupting. When I finished, he walked over and gently took my hand. "Laura," he said quietly, "truth doesn't rush." I looked up. "Let them talk," he continued. "It burns out eventually." "But what if it doesn't?" I asked. Robert thought for a moment. Then he gave a small shrug. "Then we show them the truth." A few weeks later, an unexpected opportunity appeared. Daniel's real estate firm was hosting a charity fundraiser at the Cedar Rapids Marriott. It was one of those local events where half the business owners in town show up wearing suits and pretending they enjoy networking. My boss Walter bought a table for our company. He invited Robert and me to come along. At first I hesitated. Walking into a room full of people who might be whispering about me didn't sound appealing. But Robert simply said, "Let's go." The night of the event, the Marriott ballroom was glowing under large crystal chandeliers. Soft music played through the speakers. Servers carried trays of appetizers between tables. The smell of roasted chicken and fresh bread filled the air. I wore a simple navy dress that fit comfortably around my growing belly. Robert stood beside me in a dark suit, looking slightly uncomfortable but determined. We had just finished greeting Walter when I heard a familiar voice across the room. "Oh my." Janet Harper approached like a storm cloud in heels. She was wearing a bright red dress that made sure nobody could miss her entrance. Several nearby guests immediately turned to watch. Her eyes dropped straight to my stomach. "Well," she said loudly, "would you look at that?" Robert shifted slightly closer to me. Janet folded her arms. "Funny how some women suddenly get pregnant right after trapping another man." The room went quiet. I could feel dozens of eyes turning toward us. Robert's jaw tightened, but he stayed calm. I took a slow breath. Then I reached into my purse. "Actually," I said gently, "I'm glad you brought that up." Janet blinked. I pulled out 2 envelopes. One was a letter from Dr. Patel explaining my earlier diagnosis and clarifying that pregnancy had always been possible. The other contained results from a prenatal paternity test Robert and I had agreed to take weeks earlier, just in case the rumors continued. I handed the documents to the event host standing nearby. "Would you mind reading those?" I asked. He looked surprised but nodded. The room stayed silent as he scanned the pages. Then he cleared his throat. "The medical statement confirms Laura Bennett was never infertile," he read carefully, "and the paternity test indicates a 99.9% probability that Robert Hayes is the father." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Oh wow!" Janet's face stiffened. Daniel stood across the room near the bar. For the first time that evening, our eyes met. His expression slowly collapsed into something pale and stunned. I turned back toward Janet. "The problem," I said calmly, "was never that I couldn't have children." The entire room felt still. The problem was that some people didn't have the patience to wait for a miracle. No shouting. No insults. Just the truth. Janet said nothing. She simply turned and walked toward the exit. Daniel approached a few minutes later. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Laura," he started. I raised a hand gently. "It's okay," I said. He swallowed. "I'm sorry." For a moment I studied his face. Then I nodded politely. "I hope you have a good life, Daniel." Robert placed his hand on my back as we walked away together. And in that moment I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. By the time the leaves started turning, the nursery was almost done. Robert had painted the walls a soft yellow that looked warm in the morning light. Nothing fancy, just clean, cheerful, and calm. He said yellow felt hopeful without trying too hard, and I knew exactly what he meant. 2 cribs from Target stood against opposite walls. He'd spent an entire Saturday putting them together, sitting cross-legged on the floor with an Allen wrench in one hand and the instruction booklet in the other, muttering under his breath every time the pictures skipped a step. At one point I heard him say, "Who writes these things? A sadist." I was in the rocker by the window laughing so hard I had to hold my belly. That became our life in those last months. Little moments. Quiet ones. The kind that don't look dramatic from the outside, but when you've lived through enough hurt, they feel enormous. The babies moved all the time by then. Sometimes one would kick low and the other would push against my ribs at the same moment, and I'd just sit there with my hands on my stomach, half amazed and half offended. "Your son is using my bladder as a trampoline," I told Robert one night. He looked up from a stack of folded onesies and said, "That's because he's got my athletic ability." "Please," I said, "you threw your back out reaching for a cereal box last week." He pointed at me with a tiny yellow sock. Low blow. I smiled more in those months than I had in the previous 2 years combined. That didn't mean everything was easy. Twin pregnancy at 38 is not a light little walk around the block. I was tired all the time. My ankles swelled. I got heartburn if I looked at spaghetti too long. I couldn't sleep through the night because one baby was always awake when the other settled down like they were taking shifts. There were moments I got scared too. Real scared. The kind of fear you don't talk about much because saying it out loud makes it feel bigger. What if something went wrong? What if I wasn't strong enough for all of this? What if joy could still be taken away? One afternoon after a checkup, I sat in the car outside Mercy Medical Center and just cried. Not because anything was wrong. Everything was fine. The babies were growing. Their heartbeats were strong. Dr. Patel was pleased. I cried because I finally understood how much I had been bracing for disappointment. Robert came around to my side of the truck and opened the door. "You okay?" I shook my head, then laughed through my tears. "I don't even know." He crouched a little so we were eye level. "That means no." I think I said, wiping at my face, "I'm scared to trust good things." He didn't try to fix it with some big speech. That was never his style. He just reached over and took my hand. "That makes sense," he said. "But you don't have to do this scared and alone. You can do it scared with me." That man had a way of saying simple things that landed deeper than grand promises ever did. So that's what I did. I kept going. Scared sometimes, tired often, grateful every single day. Daniel sent 3 messages over the next couple of months. The first one came the week after the fundraiser. "I know I don't deserve a response, but I'm truly sorry." The second came late one Friday night. "I keep thinking about everything. I was a coward." The third one was shorter. "I hope you're doing well." I read each one once and deleted them. Not in anger. That part was gone by then. It just didn't matter anymore. There was nothing useful in reopening that door. An apology can be sincere and still arrive too late. As for Janet, I didn't hear much after the fundraiser. Apparently, public humiliation has a way of quieting people down. Megan told me Janet stopped bringing me up once folks at church started giving her the look instead. I'm not proud to admit that gave me a little satisfaction. Not because I wanted revenge in some dramatic movie sense. I just wanted the truth to stand where her cruelty had stood. And finally it did. One Sunday afternoon, my older sister Karen came by with a casserole and 2 hand-knit baby blankets she'd found at a craft fair. She looked around the nursery and smiled. "I can't get over this," she said softly, "after everything that happened." "Me neither," I admitted. Karen sat on the edge of the spare bed and watched Robert fiddling with the baby monitor. "You know what I think," she said. "What?" "I think your life didn't fall apart. I think it got rerouted." I looked at her for a second. Then I laughed. "That sounds very wise for someone who once married a man because he owned a bass boat." She shrugged. "People grow." And she was right. People do grow. At 38, I honestly believed my story had narrowed. Not ended exactly, but narrowed. Like certain doors had closed and I was just supposed to make peace with smaller hopes. I was wrong. That's one of the strangest things about life. Sometimes the very moment that feels like rejection is really redirection, though you couldn't pay me enough to say that to someone in the middle of their heartbreak. When you're hurting, those neat little sayings don't help much. What helped me was time. Work. A few honest people. A man who didn't treat love like a transaction. And the slow, steady return of my own self-respect. That was the part I nearly lost when Daniel left. Not just the relationship. My dignity. My confidence. My sense that I was still a whole woman even if life didn't unfold the way I planned. That's why what happened at the Marriott mattered so much. It wasn't about making Daniel suffer. It wasn't even really about Janet. It was about standing in public in my own town and refusing to carry shame that never belonged to me in the first place. A week before my due date, Robert finally finished the nursery shelf he'd been building in the garage. He brought it in with Walter's help, both of them pretending it wasn't heavier than it was. "Careful," I said from the rocker. "If either of you throws out your back, I am absolutely not driving to the ER in this condition." Walter grinned. "You hear that she's still the boss." Robert set the shelf down and stepped back to look at it. Not perfect. One corner sat a tiny bit higher than the other. But it was solid. Useful. Made with care. Kinda like him, honestly. Later that night, after everyone left, I sat in the nursery with the lamp on low. Robert came in holding two tiny sleepers he'd picked up at Carter's. One had little ducks on it, the other had stars. He held them up and said, "We still haven't settled the names. We have time." He looked at my belly. "Do we?" I smiled. We'd been circling around names for weeks. Emma for a girl. Ethan for a boy. Simple, strong, familiar. Names that would age well. Names that sounded like they belonged to real people and not characters in a trendy parenting blog. I rested my hands over the curve of my stomach and felt one of the babies shift. Then the other. Two steady reminders that life can surprise you in ways that break you open and heal you at the same time. Robert sat down on the floor beside the rocker, leaned his head gently against my leg, and let out a long breath. The house was quiet. No TV. No phones. Just the hum of the baby monitor charging on the shelf and the soft sound of our old furnace kicking on. For a while, neither of us said anything. Then I looked down at him and said, "You know, if Daniel hadn't walked away..." Robert tilted his head back to look at me. "I know," he said. I thought about finishing the sentence. How different everything would have been. How I might never have found this life. But I didn't need to say it. He already understood. So I just reached down and touched his shoulder. And that was enough. The truth is, I used to think happiness arrived in one big moment. A proposal, a wedding day, a positive test, something obvious, something you could point to and say, "There." That's when my life became what I wanted. Now I think it comes quieter than that. In who stays. In who shows up. In who holds steady when things get uncertain. Daniel wanted the version of life that looked good from the outside. Robert wanted a life that felt honest from the inside. There's a big difference between those two things, and I learned it the hard way. If you've ever been left at the exact moment you needed kindness most, you know what that does to a person. It makes you question your value. It makes you replay every conversation and every flaw and wonder what made you so easy to leave. But here's what I know now. The wrong people will make you feel defective for things that were never defects. The right people won't need you to prove your worth at all. A few days later, just before dawn, I woke with a sharp cramp low in my belly. I sat up slowly and put a hand on my stomach. Another cramp came. Stronger. "Robert," I said. He was awake instantly, firefighter reflexes, I guess. "What is it?" I looked at him and smiled even through the pain. "I think they're ready." He shot out of bed so fast he nearly tripped over his own shoe. That part would be a whole story by itself. But I'll leave you with this. By the time we drove home from the hospital, tired and stunned and carrying two impossibly small human beings into our little yellow nursery, I understood something in my bones. My life had not been ruined in that Applebee's booth. It had been rerouted toward something truer, something steadier, something built to last. And if Daniel's face went pale when he saw my ultrasound, that was only because he finally understood what he had thrown away. Not a woman who might or might not have children. A loyal woman, a decent woman, a woman who would have stood by him through almost anything. He lost that. I didn't. I found the life I almost missed. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who may need a little hope today. And if you believe life can still surprise us even after heartbreaks stay a while, there are more stories to tell.